Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable lives and incredible resilience of medieval peasants. These were everyday heroes who managed to survive some of the coldest and most brutal nights in history. For the average person, winter was less about merry feasts and more about how do we not die tonight. It was a test of endurance that came around every year like a cruel teacher who did not believe in second chances. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these journeys. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine living in a tiny hut where the inside temperature was usually just a polite couple of degrees above the freezing weather outside. When we think about the transition from autumn to winter today, we usually think about switching the thermostat over or maybe digging our favorite sweater out of the back of the closet. But for a medieval peasant, the arrival of winter was not just a change in the weather. It was a looming shadow that they watched with a mixture of practiced expertise and a healthy dose of dread. It was not just a season. It was a test of endurance that came around every year, like an especially cruel teacher who did not believe in second chances. It all started with the light. As the days grew shorter, the sun did not just spend less time in the sky. It felt different. It lost that golden, heavy warmth of harvest time and turned into something thin and pale, like a watered-down ale. The shadows grew long and spindly, stretching across the fields like reaching fingers. By mid-afternoon, the world was already slipping into a deep, bruised purple. You could practically feel the sun giving up and retreating earlier and earlier every day, leaving you to face the coming dark. The landscape began to transform in ways that signaled the end of the easy times. The lush greens of summer were long gone, replaced by the rusts and browns of late autumn. But then, even those colors started to drain away. The trees, once heavy with leaves, became skeletal and stark, their branches rattling in the wind like old bones. For the people living in the village, this was the signal to kick their preparations into high gear. This was the frantic final lap of a race they had been running since the first sprouts of spring. If you missed the window to prepare, winter would not just be uncomfortable. It would be a very long and very permanent problem. The atmosphere in the village changed as well. During the harvest, there was a sense of communal noise, of shouting and singing and the busy clatter of tools. But as the first signs of frost appeared, the village grew strangely quiet. People spoke in lower tones. The sound of the axe became the dominant rhythm of life. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Every family was obsessed with wood. If you did not have a massive, towering stack of seasoned logs by your door, you were looking at a very grim future. Children were sent out into the woods to gather every scrap of kindling, every fallen branch, and every bit of dry brush they could carry. They looked like little walking bundles of sticks, scurrying back and forth to fill the woodsheds before the ground turned to iron. Then there was the smell. Have you ever stepped outside on a late October evening and smelled the cold? It is hard to describe, but you know it when it hits you. It is a sharp, metallic scent, like wet stone and dying leaves. For the medieval peasant, that smell was a warning bell. It mixed with the constant, heavy scent of wood smoke as every hearth in the village stayed lit just a little longer and a little hotter. The air became thick and heavy, clinging to your wool tunic and reminding you with every breath that the world was closing in. Observations of nature were not just a hobby back then. They were a survival skill. Peasants were master observers of the natural world because their lives depended on it. They watched the birds with an intensity we usually reserve for our phone screens. When the swallows disappeared and the geese began their long, honking journeys south, the villagers knew the clock was ticking. They watched the squirrels to see how thick their tails were and how deep they were burying their nuts. They looked at the coats of their cattle and sheep, feeling for that extra thickness of fur that signaled a particularly brutal season ahead. If the onions had thick skins or the holly trees were heavy with berries, the old-timers would shake their heads and tell everyone to gather an extra cord of wood. Folklore was their weather app, and while it might not have been scientifically accurate, it kept them alert. The moon also had its secrets. A ring around the moon meant rain or snow was coming soon. A clear, sharp moon meant a hard frost. On those crystal clear nights, the air would become so still it felt like the world was holding its breath. You would walk outside and the stars would look like ice crystals scattered across a black velvet sheet. There was no light pollution back then, no street lights or glowing windows to distract you. Just the raw, terrifying vastness of the universe looking down on your tiny, mud-smeared hut. It was on nights like these that the first real frost would arrive. Imagine waking up on that first morning. The air inside your home is so cold it hurts to breathe. Your breath forms a thick, white cloud in front of your face. You pull your ragged wool blanket tighter, but it feels like it is made of lead. You look toward the small opening in the wall that serves as a window and you see it. The world has turned white. It is not the soft, fluffy white of a deep snow, but a harsh, crystalline glitter. Every blade of grass is encased in a tiny sleeve of ice. The mud of the village path, which was soft and sucking just yesterday, has frozen into hard, treacherous ridges. The first frost was a psychological turning point. It was the moment the game changed. You could not pretend it was still autumn anymore. You could not put off that roof repair or wait another day to slaughter the pig. The frost was like a silent intruder that had finally made its presence known. It was the way of the earth saying that the time for growing is over and now we see who is strong enough to last. This was when the inspection of the home became a frantic priority. If your house was made of wattle and daub, which was a mixture of woven sticks and mud, you were constantly looking for cracks. Over the summer, the heat might have caused the mud to pull away from the timber frame. In the autumn, the rain might have softened it. Now, with the frost expanding any moisture trapped inside the walls, those cracks could become gaping wounds that let the freezing wind whistle right onto your sleeping children. You would see families out in the yard, even in the biting cold, smearing fresh layers of damp earth and straw, and that ever-useful animal dung, over the exterior of their homes. It was a race against time. If the mixture did not dry before the next hard freeze, it would just crumble and fall away, leaving you exposed. The windows, if you could even call them that, were another weak point. Glass was a fantasy for the average peasant. Instead, you had a hole in the wall. Maybe it was covered with a piece of thin, scraped animal hide that let in a ghostly, yellowish light. Maybe it was just a wooden shutter that you kept slammed shut, plunging the interior of your home into a murky, smoky darkness. As the frost bit harder, you would stuff every gap around the door and window with moss, old rags, or dried grass. You were trying to turn your home into a sealed pod, a little bubble of human warmth in a landscape that was turning hostile. Food was the other great anxiety of the first frost. The garden was done. The last of the cabbages had been pulled and the last of the leeks were dug out of the hardening soil. Now, you were living on your capital. You looked at your stores of grain, your crocks of salted butter, and your strings of dried onions with a calculating eye. You had to make this last until the first green shoots of spring, which could be 5 or even 6 months away. Every meal was a withdrawal from a bank account that did not accept deposits in the winter. The village elders were the ones everyone looked to during this time. They were the ones who had survived 20, 30, or maybe even 40 winters. They knew the rhythms of the lean months. They were the ones who reminded the younger families to save the best grain for the very end and to keep the fire bank just right. There was a grim kind of wisdom in their eyes as they watched the frost settle on the fields. They knew that for some in the village, this would be their last winter. The cold was a selective reaper and it usually went for the very old and the very young first. Despite the looming danger, there was also a strange sense of coziness that began to settle in. With the fields dormant, the grueling physical labor of the farming year finally slowed down. You were not out in the sun for 16 hours a day anymore. The world shrunk down to the size of your hearth. You spent your days carving wood, spinning wool, or repairing tools by the flickering light of the fire. The community drew closer together. If the fire of your neighbor went out, you were the one who brought them a hot coal. If a widow ran out of wood, the men of the village would bring a few logs to her door. Survival was a team sport. As the sun dips below the horizon on that first frosty evening, the village settles into a deep, heavy silence. The only sounds are the crackle of fires and the occasional lowing of a cow tucked into the end of a hut. The light has changed, the air has sharpened, and the first frost has claimed the land. The long, dark journey of winter has truly begun, and the test of medieval resilience is just getting started. But for tonight, the fire is bright, the walls are patched, and the world is still. We are going to move deeper into the heart of the winter night in just a moment. We will look at how they kept those fires going when the wood was wet and how they managed to sleep when the temperature dropped below zero. But first, just take a deep breath. Feel the warmth of your own room. Appreciate the fact that your walls are not made of mud and your floor is not dirt. We have come a long way from the freezing huts of the Middle Ages, but their story is still a part of us. It is a story of making do, of holding on, and of finding light in the darkest of times. If surviving the medieval winter was a battle of the skin, then stocking the larder was a battle of the stomach. For a peasant, the transition from autumn to winter wasn't just about watching the leaves turn brown. It was a race against the clock. Imagine the harvest is over, the golden fields are now just stubble and mud, and the first frost has already begun to sparkle on the thatch of your roof. You look at your family, you look at your empty grain bins, and you realize that every single calorie you need for the next 5 months has to be sitting inside your house right now. There are no grocery stores. There are no late-night delivery apps. There is only what you have grown, what you have gathered, and most importantly, what you have managed to preserve. If you fail this part of the game, the cold isn't the thing that will get you. It will be the hunger. The medieval larder wasn't just a pantry. It was a high-stakes survival bank account where the currency was salt, smoke, and fat. To understand how they lived, you have to understand the logic of the medieval year. In late autumn, usually around November during the feast of Saint Martin, or Martinmas, the great slaughter happened. This sounds dramatic, and for the livestock, it certainly was. But it was also a cold, hard necessity. If you were a peasant, you didn't have enough hay or grain to keep all your animals alive through the winter. You kept the breeding pairs and maybe a lucky ox, but for the rest, it was time to meet the butcher. But here is the problem. You now have an entire cow or a couple of massive pigs sitting in your yard in November. Without a refrigerator, that meat is going to turn into a biological disaster in about 3 days. This is where the ancient, boring, and brilliant science of preservation comes in. Salt was the undisputed king of the medieval larder. They called it white gold, and for good reason. If you had salt, you had a future. Salt works its magic through a process called osmosis, which is a fancy way of saying it sucks the life out of bacteria. By rubbing thick, coarse layers of salt into joints of pork or beef, the peasant was pulling the moisture out of the meat. Bacteria need moisture to throw a party and rot your dinner, so by drying it out with salt, you were effectively putting the meat into a state of suspended animation. Imagine a small, dim room filled with heavy wooden troughs. Inside those troughs are layers of bacon and ham, buried under so much salt they look like they are hidden in a snowbank. This was the dry cure. 4 smaller items. They used brine, a salty liquid so dense a fresh egg could float in it. You would submerge chunks of meat or even vegetables into these barrels, hoping the salt would reach the bone before the rot did. It was a slow, messy, and expensive process. Salt wasn't cheap. Sometimes it was traded for precious grain or even labor. But without it, your winter would be very short and very hungry. If salt was the king of preservation, smoke was the loyal knight. Most peasant homes, as we mentioned before, didn't have chimneys. Smoke just sort of hung around the rafters like a loitering teenager. But the peasants turned this annoyance into an asset. They would hang their salted hams, sausages, and sides of bacon high up in the roof, right where the smoke from the central hearth was thickest. As the smoke drifted upward, it coated the meat in a layer of phenols and other chemicals that acted like an invisible shield against flies and mold. It also gave everything that distinct, woody flavor that we still love today, though theirs was probably a bit more intense. Picture your living room, but instead of a ceiling fan, you have 20 slabs of bacon dangling over your head, slowly turning a deep, mahogany brown in the constant haze. It was the ultimate medieval air freshener. If you smelled smoke and cured fat every time you walked into your house, you knew you were doing okay. It was the smell of security. But man cannot live on salty bacon alone, though many probably tried. Grains were the actual backbone of the medieval diet. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats were the lifeblood of the village. Once the grain was harvested and threshed, it had to be kept bone dry. Moisture was the enemy. A damp grain bin was an invitation for mold or, worse, the dreaded ergot fungus, which could make an entire village hallucinate or worse. Peasants stored their grain in elevated wooden bins or thick clay jars, often keeping them close to the fire to ensure they stayed dry. This grain would be taken to the Lord's mill, ground into flour, and turned into the dense, dark bread that fueled every single day of winter. And let's not forget the liquid version of grain. Ale. In a world where water was often questionable, ale was the safe, calorie-dense choice. It was brewed in huge batches in autumn and stored in barrels. It wasn't just for getting merry. It was a liquid loaf of bread that provided the energy needed to keep the body warm. Then there were the vegetables. The medieval garden was a place of humble heroes. Turnips, leeks, onions, and cabbage were the mainstays. To keep these through the winter, peasants used a technique that was as simple as it was effective. The clamp. No, not a metal tool, but a storage pit. You would dig a shallow hole in the ground, line it with a thick layer of dry straw, and pile in your carrots and turnips. Then, you would cover the whole thing with more straw and a thick layer of earth, creating a natural, insulated root cellar. This kept the vegetables just above freezing and away from the hungry mouths of local rabbits. When you needed a turnip for your stew, you would head out into the frost, dig through the frozen dirt, and pull out a vegetable that was still crisp and fresh, thanks to the insulation of the earth. Cabbage was often fermented into something similar to sauerkraut, though they might not have called it that. Fermentation was another way to let good bacteria fight the bad ones, preserving the vitamins that kept scurvy at bay during the long months when nothing green was growing. Dairy was another puzzle to solve. Cows and goats don't produce as much milk in the winter when the grass is gone and they are eating dry hay. To save that summer abundance, peasants made cheese. Not the fancy, soft brie you find at a party today, but hard, dense, salty rounds of cheese that could break a tooth if you weren't careful. These cheeses were often washed in ale or rubbed with lard to create a thick, protective rind. They were stored in cool, dry corners, slowly maturing and waiting for the days when the larder started to look a bit thin. Butter was salted heavily and packed into stone crocks, topped with a layer of salt or even melted fat to seal out the air. In the middle of January, a smear of salty yellow butter on a hunk of hard rye bread was about as close to luxury as a peasant could get. The larder also held the tiny treasures of the autumn woods. Dried peas and beans were vital sources of protein, stored in sacks and added to the ever-bubbling pottage pot. Nuts like hazelnuts and walnuts were gathered by children and kept in jars. Honey, if you were lucky enough to have a beehive, was the only sweetener available, and it never spoiled. It was used sparingly, maybe for a festival day or to sweeten a bitter herbal tea when someone caught a winter cold. Every single item, from the smallest dried pea to the largest ham, was counted and watched with an intensity that we can't quite imagine today. You knew exactly how many sausages you had left. You knew how many scoops of grain were remaining in the barrel. This leads to the psychological weight of the winter larder. Historians talk about the hunger gap. This was the terrifying period in late winter and early spring, usually around February or March, when the winter stores were running low but the first crops of spring weren't yet ready to harvest. This was when the rationing became strict. This was when the stew got thinner and the bread got harder. You had to have the discipline of a saint to not eat your best grain in December, knowing that the leanest days were still weeks away. The larder wasn't just a physical space. It was a mental map of survival. Every time a peasant looked at their rows of salted meat and bins of grain, they were seeing their family's survival written in fat and starch. So, picture that medieval kitchen again. It is smoky, dark, and probably smells like a mix of old wood, salty pork, and fermented cabbage. It isn't a pleasant smell by modern standards, but to a peasant in the middle of a blizzard, it was the most beautiful scent in the world. It meant that the preparations had worked. It meant that despite the wind howling outside and the snow piling up against the door, there was food. There was salt to keep the meat safe, smoke to keep the rot away, and the simple, quiet victory of a well-stocked larder. They had taken the abundance of the summer and turned it into a fortress of calories. And as they sat by the hearth, listening to the crackle of the fire, they knew they had a chance to see the spring. But food was only half the battle. To truly make it through, they needed more than just a full stomach. They needed each other. And the way they organized their lives and their work during these dark months was just as ingenious as the way they salted their pork. It was a world of shared burdens and quiet resilience, where the community became the ultimate insulation against the cold. If you could keep your larder full and your neighbor close, you might just find that the winter wasn't an ending, but a long, quiet waiting for the light to return. The sheer effort of preservation meant that every member of the family had a role. The children would be the ones to pick the stones out of the dried beans, a boring and tedious task that lasted for hours by the firelight. The women would be the masters of the brine and the brew, knowing exactly when the ale was ready or if the cheese needed another rub of salt. The men would handle the heavy lifting of the slaughter and the cutting of wood to keep the fires going for the smoking process. It was a clockwork of human effort, all focused on that one goal: don't let the food run out. Even the bones of the slaughtered animals weren't wasted. They were boiled down for marrow and fat, or carved into simple tools and needles. In a medieval winter, waste was a sin. Everything had a purpose, and every scrap of fat was a shield against the frost. As the weeks turned into months, the rhythm of the larder dictated the rhythm of life. Breakfast might be a bowl of pottage, a thick, slow-cooked stew of grains and whatever vegetables survived the clamp. Lunch was a piece of bread and maybe a small chunk of that hard, salty cheese. Dinner was the main event, where a bit of that smoked bacon might be added to the pot to give everything a rich, savory flavor. They ate slowly, savoring every calorie, knowing that each bite was a deposit into their body's furnace. It was a quiet, repetitive existence, focused on the essentials. But in that repetition, there was a kind of peace. The anxiety of the harvest was gone. The work was now about maintenance and patience. The larder was the anchor that kept them steady in the storm, a testament to the fact that with enough salt, smoke, and human grit, even the harshest winter could be weathered. And as the embers of the fire glowed in the dark room, casting shadows on the hanging hams and the grain sacks, the medieval peasant could finally close their eyes, knowing that for tonight, at least, the battle was won. If you were a medieval peasant standing outside your home in late October, you weren't looking at your house with the pride of a modern homeowner showing off a new kitchen. You were looking at it with the squinted eyes of a soldier inspecting a leaky fortress. You knew that within a few weeks, the world outside was going to turn into a frozen wasteland, and the only thing standing between you and a very permanent state of popsiclehood was a few inches of sticks, mud, and dried grass. This was the moment for what we might call winterizing the Crook house, though to you, it was just the desperate annual ritual of making sure the wind stayed where it belonged, which was definitely not in your bedroom. Most peasant homes were built on what historians call a crook frame. Imagine two massive, curved oak timbers leaning against each other to form an upside-down V shape. It looks a bit like the ribs of a giant wooden whale sticking out of the ground. These frames were sturdy, which was good, because they had to hold up everything else. But the space between those ribs? That was the problem. You had to fill those gaps with something, and in the medieval world, you used whatever was under your feet and within a short walk. This brings us to the glorious, messy, and surprisingly effective world of wattle and daub. Let us start with the wattle. If you have ever seen a wicker basket, you understand the basic engineering of a medieval wall. You would take flexible wooden stakes, usually made of hazel or willow, and drive them into the ground or fix them into the timber frame. Then, you would weave thinner branches, called withies, horizontally between those stakes. It was essentially like weaving a giant, house-sized basket. This was the wattle. It provided the structure, but it was about as windproof as a chain-link fence. If you stopped there, you might as well be sleeping in a bird nest. That is where the daub comes in. Daub was the medieval version of high-performance insulation and stucco all rolled into one smelly, sticky package. The recipe was simple but specific. You needed a good amount of wet clay or soil, a generous helping of chopped straw or hay to act as a binder, and the secret ingredient, animal dung. Usually cow or horse. You weren't being gross for the sake of it. The dung contained undigested plant fibers and enzymes that made the mixture more flexible and sticky when wet, and remarkably hard when it dried. It was essentially a natural polymer. You would take this mixture and, quite literally, slap it onto the wattle. You would push it into the gaps of the weave, smoothing it over with your hands or a flat wooden tool until the wooden basket was completely encased in a thick, wet layer of mud. Congratulations, you now had a wall. As it dried, it would shrink and crack, which meant you had to go back over it with a thinner layer of lime or just more mud to seal the fissures. When finished, a well-daubed wall was surprisingly airtight. It had decent thermal mass, meaning it could soak up some of the heat from the hearth and slowly radiate it back. But it was also constantly trying to dissolve. Rain was the enemy of the daub. A particularly wet autumn could wash away sections of your wall, leaving you with a drafty hole just in time for the first frost. This is why you spent those final weeks of autumn patting and smoothing your walls like you were icing a giant, earthy cake. Once the walls were as solid as mud and manure could make them, you had to look up. The roof was perhaps the most important part of your winter survival kit. Most peasant houses were topped with thatch, a thick layer of dried vegetation. If you lived near a marsh, you used reeds. If you lived near wheat fields, you used straw. Reeds were better because they were water-resistant and lasted longer, but you used what you had. Thatching was an art form. You didn't just toss hay on the roof and hope for the best. You bundled the material into tight sheaves and lashed them to the wooden rafters, starting at the bottom and working your way up in overlapping layers. A good thatch roof could be over a foot thick. This created millions of tiny air pockets, making it one of the best insulators available in the Middle Ages. On a snowy night, a thick thatch roof could keep the heat of the fire trapped inside while the snow piled up on top, actually adding another layer of insulation. However, the thatch roof was also a living, breathing thing. It was a haven for mice, rats, and all manner of insects who were just as eager to escape the cold as you were. On a quiet winter night, you could probably hear the rustling of tiny feet directly above your head. And then there was the smoke. Remember, your house likely didn't have a chimney. The smoke from the hearth drifted up into the rafters and seeped through the thatch. While this was bad for your lungs, it was great for the roof. The soot and creosote from the smoke acted as a natural pesticide and preservative, toughening the straw and discouraging the local wildlife from eating your ceiling. Over the years, the inside of your thatch would turn a deep, shiny black, smelling of 1,000 winter fires. But even with the best walls and the thickest roof, there was still the problem of the threshold. In the medieval mind, the doorway was a weak point, both physically and spiritually. Peasants didn't have heavy, double-glazed oak doors with deadbolts. A typical door might be a few rough planks held together with wooden pegs, hanging on leather or iron hinges if you were fancy. Often, it didn't fit the frame quite right. There would be a gap at the bottom where the freezing air could whistle in, snaking across the dirt floor to bite at your ankles. To combat this, you might use a heavy woolen hanging or an old animal skin draped over the inside of the door to act as a draft excluder. Windows, if you had them at all, were tiny. Glass was a fantasy, something you might see in a cathedral but never in your own home. A window was literally a wind hole. In the winter, you plugged these holes with whatever you could. Some people used thin pieces of horn that had been soaked and scraped until they were translucent, allowing a dull, gray light to filter in. Others used linen cloth soaked in oil or animal fat, which made the fabric somewhat translucent and helped keep the wind out. Most, however, just used wooden shutters that they slammed shut at dusk and didn't open again until the sun was well up. If you were truly poor, you stuffed the window hole with a bundle of straw or a scrap of old sheepskin. The goal was simple. Total darkness was a small price to pay for a few degrees of extra warmth. The floor was your final battleground. Most peasant houses had floors of compacted earth. As the ground outside froze, the cold would seep up into the dirt inside. To fight this, you would lay down fresh rushes or straw. In the summer, these might be mixed with sweet-smelling herbs like lavender or meadowsweet. In the winter, you didn't care about the smell as much as the depth. You wanted a thick, springy layer between your feet and the cold earth. However, as the winter wore on, these rushes would become damp and dirty. They would trap food scraps, spilled ale, and the occasional bit of animal waste, creating a fermenting, matted layer that was part carpet and part compost pile. It was warm, certainly, but it was not what we would call hygienic. As you worked on your home, you were also thinking about your livestock. In many parts of medieval Europe, the house was a longhouse, meaning you and your cows lived under the same roof. There was usually a low wooden partition separating the family area from the byre, or the animal stalls. You might think that sharing your living room with a cow was a sign of extreme poverty, and in a way it was, but in the winter, it was also a brilliant survival strategy. A single cow produces a massive amount of body heat. By bringing the animals inside, you were essentially installing a living, breathing, four-legged space heater. The heat from the cattle would drift over the partition, helping to keep the entire house a few degrees above freezing. Of course, you had to deal with the smell and the noise of a ruminating heifer at 3 in the morning, but when the wind was howling through the thatch, the sound of a cow chewing its cud was the sound of safety. Maintenance was a daily chore. You would spend your evenings listening for the telltale whistle of a new draft. When you found one, you would jump up to plug the hole with a bit of moss, a rag, or a fresh handful of mud kept in a bucket near the door. You were constantly patching, stuffing, and sealing. You were strengthening the threshold against a winter that wanted nothing more than to find a way inside. The air inside the house would be thick. It was a mixture of wood smoke, the earthy scent of the daub, the smell of damp straw, and the heavy musk of the animals. It was humid, too, as the moisture from the breathing inhabitants and the cooking pot condensed on the cold walls. To a modern person, it would be suffocating. To a medieval peasant, it was the smell of home. It was the smell of a place that had been successfully sealed against the elements. When the work was finally done, and the final gap in the wattle had been smeared with dung and straw, you could finally sit back. The house was as ready as it was ever going to be. The golden straw of the new thatch looked bright against the grey autumn sky, and the walls were thick and solid. You had strengthened the threshold. You had built your fortress of mud and grass. And as the first snowflakes began to drift down from a leaden sky, you could duck inside, pull the heavy skin over the door, and feel the slight, precious warmth of the hearth and the animals. The winter was here, but for now, the basket was holding. The walls were standing. You were tucked away in your smoky, earthy sanctuary, ready to wait for the distant promise of spring. If medieval homes had a single hero during winter, it was not the roof, or the walls, or even the brave layers of dirt and dung insulation. It was the hearth. A crackling, stubborn, sometimes smoky fire pit that served as the only real defense against the cold, the darkness, and the general gloom of medieval life. At the center of nearly every peasant home was a simple fire. You have to understand that this was not a fireplace with a fancy stone mantel or a neat chimney sweeping the smoke skyward like you see in period dramas. Instead, you had a basic pit or a pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke pouring into the room to make you wonder if you were slowly becoming a piece of ham. That is right. Most homes did not even have chimneys. Smoke just kind of did its best to find a way out. It drifted toward the ceiling, swirling around the rafters before eventually seeping out through small holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or right into your lungs if the wind was blowing the wrong way that evening. It was not ideal for breathing or your overall lifespan, but on the bright side, it did a great job of fumigating fleas and other unwanted guests. Who needs pest control when you are marinating in smoke 24 hours a day? The hearth was not just about warmth, though. It was the kitchen, the primary light source, and essentially the medieval version of a television. People sat around the fire telling stories, gossiping, or just staring into the flames because, frankly, there was not much else to do after the sun went down. Keeping the fire alive was not just a nice idea or a comfort choice. It was mandatory. Letting the fire die out at night was like putting up a sign for the cold to come in and finish you off. Plus, reigniting a fire in the middle of a medieval winter was not as easy as striking a match. You had to work with flint, steel, kindling, and more prayers than you had probably offered all year. Everyone in the family had a duty when it came to the fire. There was stoking the flames, watching the embers, and adding fuel like peat, sticks, or if you were lucky, a precious piece of dry wood. It was a constant battle between human persistence and the smothering cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff you out. The hearth did not guarantee survival, but without it, survival was downright impossible. It was a smoky, sputtering, often disappointing little fire, but in a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was letting that fire go out overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after a harvest. And in the dead of winter, restarting a fire from scratch was more than just inconvenient. It could be deadly. Matches did not exist yet. Lighters were a distant dream. Rekindling a fire meant striking flint and steel together, praying for a single precious spark, and then cuddling that spark with tender love and whatever dry kindling you had not already burned days ago. Imagine trying to do all of this in the freezing dark, half asleep, with fingers so cold they felt like wooden blocks. This is why peasants got smart and practiced the art of banking the fire. Banking did not involve a savings account, though the fire was certainly their most valuable asset. To bank a fire meant carefully burying the glowing embers under a thick mound of ash right before heading to bed. The ash acted like a heavy blanket, insulating the coals and keeping them alive, just barely, until the morning. If you did it correctly, you could stroll over at sunrise, poke the pile a little bit, add some fresh wood, and voila, you had a fire without the risk of frostbite. But if you did it wrong, well, let us just say the morning got a whole lot colder and a whole lot grumpier for everyone involved. Fire banking was a skill passed down from parent to child like a prized family recipe. Everyone had their own little secrets. Some insisted on using dry ash only. Others thought a bit of dampness was the key to a slow burn. Some packed the embers tight, while others let them breathe just a tiny bit. You could practically start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better way to bank the hearth. It was the ancient version of arguing over the best way to use a thermostat, just with slightly higher survival stakes. Sometimes even banking the fire was not enough. A howling wind might sneak through a crack in the wall and snuff it out anyway. Or a clumsy animal might stumble into the hearth. Yes, that actually happened. This is why some families took turns getting up in the middle of the night to check on the coals. It was basically the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to the living room to make sure the heater was still running. In the end, fire banking was less about mastering nature and more about buying just a few more precious hours of warmth. If you woke up to even a single surviving ember, that was your victory right there. That was enough to face another day of battling the elements. The fuel used for these fires was another constant concern. Wood was the most common, but in many areas, forests were strictly managed by the lord of the manor. You could not just go out and chop down a tree whenever you felt a chill. Peasants were often restricted to what was called hook or crook, meaning they could only take branches they could reach with a shepherd's hook or find on the ground. This led to a lot of time spent scavenging for sticks and fallen limbs. In areas where wood was scarce, people turned to peat. Peat is basically ancient, decayed vegetation found in bogs. It had to be cut into bricks and dried for months before it would burn. It did not produce a bright, cheery flame like oak or pine, but it glowed with a steady, low heat and had a very distinct, earthy smell that would cling to your clothes and hair for weeks. For a medieval peasant, the smell of burning peat was the smell of home. It was the smell of not being frozen. And if peat was not available, they were not above using dried animal dung. It was cheap, it was everywhere, and while it might not sound like the height of luxury, it burned remarkably well. When the temperature is dropping toward zero, you stop being picky about what keeps you warm. The layout of the house also revolved entirely around the hearth. Because there were no hallways or separate rooms in most peasant dwellings, the heat had to radiate from that one central point. This meant that the closer you were to the fire, the higher your status was for the night. The elderly and the very young were usually given the spots nearest to the warmth. If you were a healthy teenager or a sturdy farmhand, you were likely relegated to the outer edges of the circle, where the heat was more of a suggestion than a reality. Living with an open fire in the middle of a room also meant that everything was covered in a fine layer of soot. The walls, the thatch of the roof, the clothes on your back, and even the food in your pot had a smoky quality to it. This soot actually had an unintended benefit. It helped to seal the thatched roof, making it more water-resistant and less attractive to nesting birds and rodents. It was a messy, grimy way to live, but it was a functional ecosystem. The fire provided the heat, the smoke provided the sealant, and the family provided the labor to keep it all going. The social life of the winter was dictated by the light of the hearth. Once the sun went down in December, the world was pitch black. Candles were expensive and usually reserved for the church or the wealthy. Most peasants relied on rushlights, which were just dried rushes dipped in animal fat. They gave off a dim, flickering light and smelled exactly like you would expect burning fat to smell. Because of this, the hearth was the only place where you could actually see what you were doing. This is where the oral tradition of the Middle Ages truly thrived. In the long hours between the last meal and the time everyone huddled together for sleep, the fire was the center of the world. Grandparents would tell stories of saints, of local legends, or of the legendary winters of the past. It was a way to pass the time and to keep spirits high when the wind was screaming outside. The crackle of the logs and the shifting of the embers provided the background music for these tales. It was a quiet, slow existence, but there was a profound sense of connection in those moments. You were not just a person alone in the cold. You were part of a circle, bound together by the light of a single fire. As the night deepened, the fire would be carefully banked, the smoke would slowly clear from the lower half of the room, and the house would settle into a cold, heavy silence. The perennial fire was a reminder that even in the darkest, most brutal months of the year, there was a spark of life that could be maintained with enough care and effort. It was the sacred duty of the household to guard that spark. Because as long as the hearth was warm, the winter had not won yet. The hearth was a humble thing, made of stones and ash and hard work, but it was the one thing that truly turned a mud and stick hut into a sanctuary. It was the light in the dark, the warmth in the frost, and the promise that, if you could just keep the embers glowing until morning, you would make it through to see the spring. You would find yourself watching those embers, listening to the wood pop, and feeling the gradual slide of time as the night wore on. It was a slow, meditative process, a requirement of life that demanded your full attention and your total respect. And in that smoky, quiet room, the fire was everything. If the hearth was the beating heart of a medieval home, then the clothes on a peasant's back were the final, desperate line of defense against a winter that wanted to turn them into a statue. We often think of medieval fashion as being either very fancy, like the velvet gowns in movies, or very drab, like the brown potato sacks you see in gritty television shows. But for the person trying to survive a January blizzard in a drafty hut, clothes were basically a wearable fortress. They didn't have high-tech synthetic fibers or waterproof shells. They had nature, and nature is often very scratchy, very heavy, and very, very smelly when it gets wet. To understand how they stayed warm, you have to think like an onion. Layering wasn't just a fashion choice. It was the only way to trap enough body heat to stay upright. The process started with the layer closest to the skin, which was almost always linen. Now, linen is made from the flax plant, and for a peasant, this was the only fabric that ever really saw a bucket of water. It was breathable, relatively soft after it had been beaten and worn for a few years, and it served as a sweat barrier between the body and the heavy wool garments on top. Men wore a long linen shirt that reached their knees, and women wore a similar garment called a chemise or a smock. In the summer, this might be all you wore while working the fields, but in winter, this was just the foundation. It was the white, slightly yellowed base layer that you hoped stayed clean because washing anything else was a nightmare. Once the linen was on, the real work began. Over the shirt came the wool. If there is one fabric that defined the medieval winter, it was wool. It was everywhere. It was the superpower of the Middle Ages. Sheep were the backbone of the economy, and their fleece was turned into everything from blankets to hats to leggings. Medieval wool wasn't the soft, merino stuff you find in high-end boutiques today. It was coarse, heavy, and full of lanolin, which is the natural grease found in sheep's wool. While that sounds a bit gross, lanolin was actually a secret weapon. It made the fabric somewhat water-resistant. If you were caught in a light rain, the water would bead up on the surface of your tunic rather than soaking straight through to your skin. A peasant would pull on a heavy wool tunic, or perhaps two if it was particularly biting outside. These tunics were often cinched at the waist with a simple leather cord or a woven belt. For women, the layer over the chemise was a kirtle, a long wool dress that reached the floor. If you think walking through snow in a long dress sounds difficult, you are right. The hem of a woman's dress in winter was almost constantly damp and caked with half-frozen mud. To combat the cold from the ground, people wore hose. These weren't like modern tights. They were two separate fabric tubes, usually made of sturdy wool, that were tied to the belt of the undergarments. They were thick, they were itchy, and they were the only thing keeping your legs from turning into icicles. But the layers didn't stop at the torso and legs. The head and neck were just as important. If you have ever seen a medieval peasant in an old illustration, you have probably noticed they are often wearing a strange-looking hood that covers their shoulders. This was a chaperon or a simple hood with a shoulder cape called a gorget. It was a brilliant design for a cold climate. By covering the head, neck, and the tops of the shoulders, it prevented heat from escaping out of the collar of the tunic. Some of these hoods had a long, ridiculous-looking tail called a liripipe. While it might look like a fashion victim's choice, that long tail could be wrapped around the neck like a scarf or used to tie the hood in place when the wind started howling. Now, we have to talk about fur. When we think of fur, we usually think of kings and queens in ermine or sable, looking very regal and very expensive. And while it is true that the nobility had the best furs, peasants were actually very big fans of fur too. They just used the versions that were running around their gardens. Rabbit, squirrel, and even cat or dog fur were commonly used to line garments. If you could catch it, you could wear it. Fur was the medieval version of a down jacket. It trapped air and provided an incredible amount of warmth that wool alone couldn't match. A peasant might have a vest made of rabbit skins worn under their tunic, or a cloak lined with the fur of a particularly unlucky fox. It wasn't about status. It was about staying alive. The outermost layer was the cloak. This was usually a massive, circular piece of heavy wool that could be wrapped around the body like a wearable tent. It was your jacket, your raincoat, and often your blanket when you went to sleep. A good cloak was a peasant's most prized possession. It was thick enough to stop the wind and heavy enough to make your shoulders ache by the end of the day. When it rained or snowed, that wool cloak would soak up the moisture and become incredibly heavy, smelling like a wet dog that had been rolling in with smoke. But even when wet, wool has a remarkable ability to retain heat. That was the magic of the material. It might be miserable to wear, but it wouldn't let you freeze. Footwear was perhaps the weakest point in the medieval winter wardrobe. Leather was expensive and difficult to keep waterproof. Most peasants wore simple leather-turned shoes, which were sewn inside out and then flipped. These had very thin soles and provided almost no insulation against the frozen ground. To stay warm, people would stuff their shoes with dried grass or straw. It was like a medieval version of an insole, providing a little bit of a buffer between the foot and the ice. If you were lucky, you might have wooden clogs or pattens, which were basically wooden platforms you strapped to your shoes to lift your feet out of the mud and snow. But for many, winter meant damp feet from dawn until dusk. Maintenance of these clothes was a completely different struggle. Today, we throw our clothes in the wash after one wear, but in a medieval winter, that was a death sentence for your wardrobe. Washing wool was a massive undertaking that required huge amounts of water, soap that smelled like lye, and days of drying time that you just didn't have when the sun set at 4 in the afternoon. Most clothes went the entire winter without ever being fully washed. Instead, people would brush the dried mud off their cloaks and tunics and hope for the best. Over time, the layers of smoke from the fire, sweat from the body, and grease from the wool created a sort of protective crust. It wasn't hygienic by our standards, but that buildup actually helped block the wind. You were a walking, talking ecosystem of grime, but you were a warm one. When night fell and it was time to sleep, the layering didn't stop. People didn't have pajamas. They usually just took off their outer tunic and climbed into their hay beds wearing their linen undergarments and perhaps their hose. Then, they piled everything they owned on top of them. The heavy cloaks, the extra tunics, and the fur vests became the quilts. If you had a family of 6, you were all huddling under a mountain of wool and fur, sharing your body heat and the various smells of your day. It was cramped and it was probably quite itchy, but under that heavy pile, the cold couldn't reach you as easily. There is something almost impressive about the sheer weight of a medieval winter. Between the heavy wool, the leather, the fur, and the dampness, a person might be carrying 20 or 30 extra pounds of gear just to go out and feed the livestock. Every movement was a chore. You didn't run in the winter. You trudged. You moved with a slow, deliberate heavy grace, knowing that every calorie you burned was one less bit of fuel for your internal fire. Your clothes were a burden, but they were a burden that kept you from becoming part of the permafrost. So the next time you put on a lightweight, waterproof jacket with a zipper and a fleece lining, take a second to appreciate it. You don't have to worry about your hem being caked in frozen mud. You don't have to stuff your shoes with straw. And most importantly, you probably don't smell like a damp goat. Medieval peasants were the ultimate masters of the human onion, peeling back and adding on layers in a never-ending dance with the elements. It was scratchy, it was heavy, and it was constant work. But in a world where the cold was a hungry ghost, these layers of wool and linen were the only thing that kept the ghost at bay. And as the wind whistled through the thatch and the fire began to fade, those layers were the most valuable things in the world. Imagine waking up in a world where the sun seems to have given up and gone on a very long vacation. For a medieval peasant in Northern Europe, the weeks surrounding the winter solstice weren't just chilly, they were an exercise in deep, heavy darkness. If you lived in a place like England or Scandinavia, the sun might not even clear the horizon until well after 9 in the morning. And by 3 or 4 in the afternoon, it was already waving goodbye, leaving you in a twilight that felt more like a thick, woolen blanket than a time of day. This was the era of midwinter shadows, a time when the shortest days of the year felt like a test of mental and spiritual endurance. In a world without light switches, street lamps, or even the glow of a digital clock, darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a physical presence that moved into your house and stayed there for 16 hours a day. When you spend that much time in the dark, light becomes your most precious resource. But light in the Middle Ages was anything but easy to come by. If you were a peasant, you weren't exactly lighting up a dozen fragrant beeswax candles every evening. Beeswax was the luxury of the church and the nobility. It smelled sweet, burned clean, and cost about as much as a small cow. For the average person living in a mud and stick hut, light was smoky, smelly, and very, very dim. The most common source of light for the working class was something called a rushlight. To make one, you had to go out to the marshes in late summer, gather meadow rushes, and carefully peel back the outer skin to reveal the white, spongy pith inside. Then, you dipped that pith into leftover animal fat, usually mutton or beef tallow, and let it harden. Congratulations, you were now the proud owner of a medieval glow stick. A rushlight was essentially a long, greasy piece of plant matter that you would clip into a simple iron holder. It didn't burn with a steady, bright flame. Instead, it sputtered and hissed, casting a weak, flickering light that barely reached across the table. A single rushlight might burn for 15 or 20 minutes before you had to adjust it or light another one. It was the medieval equivalent of having a phone battery that was constantly at 1%. You didn't use it to read or do fine needlework. You used it just so you didn't accidentally step on the cat or trip over the hearthstones. If you wanted to see anything clearly, you had to be within a foot of the flame, which also meant you were probably inhaling the lovely aroma of burning sheep fat. If you were feeling particularly fancy or had a bit of extra money, you might use a tallow candle. These were made by repeatedly dipping a wick into melted animal fat. While they lasted longer than rushlights, they were still a sensory nightmare. Tallow candles produced a thick, black smoke that coated the walls, the ceiling, and your lungs in a layer of greasy soot. They also had a habit of melting into a puddle if the room got too warm, and the smell was described as being remarkably similar to a very old, very dirty kitchen. In the deep winter, a medieval home was a place of shadows and soot, where everyone lived in a perpetual state of squinting. This lack of light did strange things to the human mind. When you live in a world where you can only see 6 feet in front of you for the majority of your life, the shadows start to take on a life of their own. This is why winter folklore is so filled with ghosts, spirits, and things that go bump in the night. To a medieval peasant, the darkness was crowded. When the sun was weak and the days were short, people believed the veil between our world and the spirit world grew thin. They spoke of the wild hunt, a terrifying spectral procession of ghost riders and hounds that flew across the winter sky, led by a dark figure or an ancient god. If you were caught outside when the wild hunt passed, you might be swept away and never seen again. Naturally, this gave everyone a very good reason to stay inside, huddle near the fire, and keep the doors bolted tight. Even the rafters of your own home weren't entirely safe. The flickering shadows from the hearth could look like monsters, and every creak of the thatch roof sounded like a heavy footstep. To combat this creeping gloom, medieval people leaned heavily into communal life. The long winter nights were the season of the storyteller. This was the medieval version of binge-watching a series, but instead of a screen, you had a grandmother or a local elder who knew every legend, every family scandal, and every ancient myth by heart. People would sit around the fire for hours, spinning wool or mending tools by touch, while someone wove a tale that could last for 3 nights straight. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were the way history and culture were passed down. They were also a vital way to keep the winter blues away. While we today might call it seasonal affective disorder, a medieval peasant just called it the winter heaviness. They knew that if you sat alone in the dark for too long, your spirit would start to wither, so they gathered together to share warmth, breath, and words. Time itself became a very different concept during these midwinter weeks. Without the sun to mark the passing hours, time became elastic and blurry. For most peasants, the day wasn't measured in minutes but in the ringing of church bells. The local monastery or parish church followed the canonical hours, ringing bells for matins in the middle of the night, lauds at dawn, and vespers at sunset. These bells were the audio clock of the medieval world. They told you when to pray, when to rest, and when it was finally acceptable to stop working. But in the dead of winter, when the sun barely bothered to show up, the bells were often the only thing that kept the day from melting into one long, undifferentiated stretch of gray. You lived your life by the sound of iron hitting bronze, echoing through the cold, misty air. The winter solstice was the absolute peak of this darkness, but it was also a moment of intense, quiet hope. Even though it was the shortest day and the longest night, it was the turning point. From that moment on, the sun was technically winning the battle. Every day after the solstice was a few minutes longer, even if you couldn't see it yet. This is why the Yule log was such a huge deal. A family would select a massive, sturdy log, often the base of a tree, and bring it into the hearth with great ceremony. It was supposed to burn, or at least smolder, for the 12 days of Christmas. It was a symbol of the sun's return, a physical manifestation of the light that was slowly, painfully slowly, coming back to the world. They would keep a piece of the previous year's log to light the new one, creating a chain of fire that stretched back through generations. It was a way of saying that the darkness might be deep, but it would never be permanent. Navigating these shortest days required a specific kind of mental grit. You had to be comfortable with silence, with the smell of tallow, and with the feeling of your own heartbeat in a room where you couldn't see your own hands. You had to trust that the bells would ring, the fire would hold, and the sun would eventually find its way back to the valley. It was a slow, quiet existence, far removed from our world of instant information and perpetual brightness. But there was a certain beauty in it too, a forced slowing down that allowed for deep reflection and a profound connection to the people sitting right next to you in the shadows. As the midwinter shadows stretched their longest across the dirt floors, the medieval peasants simply pulled their cloak a little tighter, added a stick to the fire, and waited for the light. And while they waited, they told another story, because in the deep dark, a voice was often the only light you had left. The psychological toll of this darkness cannot be overstated. When the environment is that dim for that long, the human body and mind enter a sort of semi-hibernation. Work in the fields was impossible, so life moved entirely indoors. This transition from the wide, open world of summer to the cramped, smoky interior of a one-room hut was a jarring shift. You went from the infinite sky to a world that was maybe 20 feet wide. Privacy, as we have discussed, was a myth, but in the midwinter shadows, the lack of privacy became a survival mechanism. You needed to hear the person next to you breathing to know you weren't alone in the void. Every sound became amplified. The rustle of straw bedding, the chewing of a cow in the corner, the pop of a damp log in the fire. These were the rhythms of the shortest days, the sounds of a life pared down to its absolute essentials. It was also a time for riddles. Medieval people loved a good riddle. It was a way to sharpen the mind when the body was idle. They would challenge each other to describe common objects in impossible ways, a way of proving that even in the dark, their intellect was still bright. Riddles about the sun, the wind, and the ice were common, as if by naming these things and capturing them in clever words, the peasants could exert a little bit of control over the elements that were trying to freeze them out. These mental games were just as important as the fire in the hearth. They kept the brain active when the horizon was nothing but a wall of black. They reminded everyone that they were still thinking, still dreaming, and still human, even when the world outside looked like a desolate, frozen wasteland. As the days finally began to lengthen, however slightly, a subtle shift occurred in the village. The mood would lift just a fraction. You still had months of cold ahead of you, and February was often the cruelest month for hunger, but the return of the light was a psychological victory. You could see the outline of the trees a little earlier in the morning. You could finish a meal before the rushlight burned out. These tiny gains were celebrated with a quiet, solemn joy. The shortest days had been navigated, the shadows had been endured, and once again, the medieval peasant had proven that they were more stubborn than the winter itself. They had lived through the great dark, and though they were covered in soot and smelled of sheep fat, they were still there to see the first weak rays of the January sun. And as the fire in the hearth turned to glowing embers, they knew they had made it through the hardest part of the year, one flickering shadow at a time. So, you have survived the freezing wind, you have banked your fire, and you have tucked your favorite cow into the corner of the room. You might think that with the sun setting at 4 in the afternoon and the world outside buried under a foot of snow, it was finally time to relax. Maybe kick back and listen to a podcast about 21st century problems. But for a medieval peasant, the end of the day did not mean the end of the work. Not even close. Winter was not a vacation. It was just a different kind of shift. If the summer was for the fields, the winter was for the fingers. While the world outside went into a deep, icy sleep, the inside of a peasant hut became a tiny, smoky, dim factory. Welcome to the world of indoor labor by candlelight. And when I say candlelight, I am being generous. Most peasants could not afford actual wax candles. Those were for the church or the local lord who liked to show off his ability to buy things that literally vanished into thin air. For the average person, light was a precious, stinky, and very flickering commodity. If you were lucky, you had tallow candles, which were made from rendered animal fat. Imagine the smell of a cheap burger joint that has not cleaned its grill in 3 years, and you are halfway to understanding the medieval indoor aroma. Tallow candles sputtered, they dripped greasy black soot everywhere, and they gave off about as much light as a very depressed firefly. If you were not lucky enough to have tallow, you used rushlights. These were basically long reeds dipped in fat. You would peel the outer layer of a meadow rush, soak the pith in whatever grease you had left over from dinner, and then prop it up in a little iron holder. A good rushlight might last 20 minutes if the breeze did not catch it. It was the medieval equivalent of trying to do your taxes by the light of a single match. It was dim, it was shaky, and it was absolutely brutal on the eyes. This was the environment where most of the clothes, tools, and household items for the coming year were produced. It was a time of quiet, rhythmic, and incredibly tedious labor. The most iconic sound of a medieval winter evening was the whir of the spindle or the soft scrape of wood being carved. For the women of the house, winter meant spinning. Always spinning. It was so constant that the term spinster eventually became synonymous with an unmarried woman because, frankly, what else was she doing with her time? Spinning wool was the heartbeat of the home. Before you could have a tunic or a blanket or even a pair of socks, someone had to turn a pile of raw, greasy sheep fluff into usable thread. This was done using a distaff and a drop spindle. Imagine holding a long stick under your arm with a clump of wool on it and using a weighted wooden tool to pull and twist that wool into a fine string. It took miles of thread to make a single piece of cloth. If you stopped spinning, the family stopped having clothes. It was as simple as that. Imagine doing this for 6 hours straight every single night in a room filled with smoke and the smell of a damp goat. You are sitting as close to the hearth as possible without catching your skirt on fire, your eyes are straining to see the fibers in the dim yellow light, and your fingers are stained with lanolin. It was meditative in a way, but it was also exhausting. There were no breaks to check your phone or get a snack. You just spun and spun until the rushlight flickered out or your eyes simply refused to stay open. Every thread was a tiny victory against the winter, a piece of the armor that would keep the family warm in the years to come. While the women were busy with textiles, the men were usually occupied with what we might call the heavy maintenance. Just because the ground was too frozen to plow did not mean the tools were fine. Plows broke. Harnesses snapped. Clogs wore down until they were more like thin pieces of bark than shoes. Winter was the time to fix everything. If you had a broken wooden spoon, you did not go to a store to buy a new one. You sat by the fire with a piece of seasoned wood and a small knife and you whittled a new one. This was the era of the handmade everything. Spoons, bowls, handles for axes, even the buttons on your tunic were likely carved right there in the flickering shadows of the hearth. Leatherwork was another big winter project. Shoes in the Middle Ages were not exactly durable. They were often just pieces of tanned hide stitched together with sinew or strong thread. Walking through the mud and slush of a medieval village was like putting your footwear through a wood chipper. By the time December rolled around, most shoes were more holes than leather. So, you would sit there, poking a bone needle through thick hide, trying to patch up your boots so your toes did not fall off the next time you went to the well. It was slow work, and it was hard on the hands. But there was a certain satisfaction in it. There was a rhythm to the labor that helped pass the long, dark hours between sunset and sleep. And let us not forget the mending. Everything was mended. Nothing was ever thrown away. If a tunic got a hole, you patched it. If the patch got a hole, you patched the patch. By the end of a long winter, most peasants looked like they were wearing a very complicated, very itchy jigsaw puzzle. The goal was utility, not fashion. If it kept the heat in, it was a masterpiece. This constant cycle of repair was the only thing standing between a family and total ruin. In a world where resources were scarce, your labor was your only real currency. You traded your time and your eyesight for a few more months of use out of a tattered woolen cloak. But it was not all silent, grim grinding. These long winter nights were also the peak season for the medieval version of social media, storytelling and gossip. When you are crammed into a tiny room with your entire family, 3 neighbors, and a very judgmental sheep, you are going to talk. This was how history was passed down. This was how news traveled. You would hear about whose cow was acting strange, which village over the hill had run out of grain, and legendary tales about saints, giants, or the time the local lord fell off his horse into a pile of mud. The elders would tell the old stories, the ones they had heard from their own grandparents. These stories were a way to keep the mind occupied while the hands did the boring work. It is much easier to spin wool for 4 hours if someone is telling you a gripping story about a knight fighting a dragon or a clever fox outsmarting a wolf. These tales often had a moral, or they were warnings about the dangers of the forest at night. They were the background music to the winter labor. The sound of a human voice, steady and familiar, was just as important as the fire in the hearth. It kept the gloom at bay. It reminded everyone that they were part of a community, a long line of people who had sat in this same darkness and done this same work. Of course, the environment was less than ideal for fine craftsmanship. Most peasant homes were incredibly smoky because, as we discussed, chimneys were a high-end luxury that most people did not have. The smoke from the fire would swirl around the rafters, making everyone cough and giving everything a permanent coating of soot. This meant that whatever you were making, whether it was a new wooden bowl or a woolen shirt, it was going to smell like wood smoke forever. But honestly, compared to the smell of the livestock and the tallow candles, wood smoke was probably the best part of the sensory experience. The physical toll of this indoor labor is something we often forget. We think of medieval life as being physically demanding because of the farming, but the indoor work was a different kind of hard. Eye strain was a massive issue. Imagine trying to sew a fine seam or carve a delicate handle when the only light is a flickering, dim flame and the air is thick with smoke. Many peasants developed vision problems early in life. Their world was one of shadows and blurred edges. Chronic back pain from leaning over the fire to see your work was also common. It was a life of constant, low-level physical discomfort. But again, the alternative was far worse. You worked because you had to. You worked because the spring was coming, and when it arrived, you needed to be ready. There was also a certain pressure to these crafts. You were not whittling for fun. You were whittling because if the wooden handle on your spade snapped in March and you did not have a replacement, you could not plant your crops. And if you could not plant your crops, you did not eat. The stakes for these quiet, indoor crafts were actually incredibly high. Every stitch in a leather shoe was a stitch against the coming hunger. Every mile of woolen thread was a barrier against the cold. It was a productive kind of anxiety. As the night wore on and the fire died down, the work would slowly taper off. The tools would be tucked away in chests or hung on the walls. The half-finished carvings would be placed on a shelf, and the spindles would finally stop their spinning. The family would huddle closer together, the last bit of warmth from the hearth fading into the room. They had spent their evening turning the darkness into something useful. They had taken the raw materials of their harsh world and shaped them into survival. So, the next time you feel like you have too much on your to-do list, just remember the medieval peasant. They did not have the luxury of a weekend. They did not have the benefit of a 60-watt light bulb. They just had a stinky candle, a pile of wool, and the sheer, stubborn determination to make sure that when the sun finally rose, they would be one step closer to making it through the year. The winter was long, and the work was boring, but it was the work that kept them alive. And as the last rushlight flickered out, leaving the room in a thick, velvety darkness, the quiet rhythm of the house would shift from the sound of labor to the sound of sleep, resting for just a few hours before the cold gray dawn called them to do it all over again. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon at 4 in the afternoon, and the world outside became a frozen, ink-black void, the medieval peasant's world shrank to the size of a single room. The walls were thin, the wind was hungry, and the only thing standing between you and the crushing silence of a winter night was the flickering, smoky orange glow of the hearth. But as we have seen, the fire was more than just a source of heat. It was a shield, not just against the frost, but against the things that lived in the dark. In the medieval mind, winter wasn't just a season of cold weather. It was a time when the veil between our world and the supernatural world became thin and tattered, like an old wool tunic. When the nights are that long, your imagination starts to fill the shadows with more than just dust bunnies. For the medieval family huddled together on their straw mats, the winter was a season of stories. These weren't just bedtime tales to keep the kids quiet. They were the television, the news, and the survival guide all rolled into one. And tonight, we're going to step into that circle of firelight and explore the folklore and winter tales that kept medieval people awake long after the fire began to dim. Picture the scene again. You are packed in with your family and your livestock. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, wet wool, and the occasional suspicious scent of a goat. Outside, a branch scrapes against the thatch like a skeletal finger. In the modern world, we know that is just the wind. But to a peasant in the 14th century, that could be anything. It could be a restless spirit, a hungry goblin, or perhaps the vanguard of the wild hunt. The wild hunt was perhaps the most terrifying winter legend across much of Europe. Imagine a ghostly procession of hunters, hounds, and horses galloping across the night sky or through the deepest parts of the forest. Depending on where you lived, the leader might be Odin, King Arthur, or even a local lord who had been cursed for hunting on a Sunday. To hear the baying of their spectral hounds was an omen of disaster. If you were foolish enough to be outside when the hunt passed by, you might be swept up and carried away forever, or worse, forced to join the ghastly parade for all eternity. Families would huddle closer to the fire, whispering prayers and making sure the door was barred tight. The wind howling down the chimney wasn't just weather. It was the sound of the dead riding the storm. But it wasn't all grand, terrifying hunts in the sky. Some of the most persistent winter folklore involved the creatures that lived right in your own backyard, or even inside your walls. We think of elves and fairies today as cute little things with wings and glitter. Medieval people knew better. Their elves were dangerous, fickle, and often quite grumpy, especially in winter when they were just as cold and hungry as everyone else. There was a real sense that you had to share your space with the unseen. If you were lucky, you might have a brownie or a house spirit who would help with the chores if you left out a bowl of cream. But in winter, when food was scarce, leaving out that cream felt like a real sacrifice. If you forgot, or if you were disrespectful, those spirits might sour your milk, not your horse's menere, or hide your only pair of shoes. Folklore was a way to explain why bad things happened to good people. If the cow died or the roof leaked, it was easier to blame a mischievous spirit than to accept that life was just randomly cruel. It gave you a sense of control. If you followed the rules and told the right stories, maybe, just maybe, the spirits would leave you in peace. Then there were the winter monsters that were specifically designed to keep you on your best behavior. You have probably heard of Krampus, the hairy, horned beast who accompanies St. Nicholas to punish the naughty children. While we think of him as a fun, spooky tradition now, for a medieval child in the Alpine regions, the threat was very real. Imagine being told that if you didn't finish your spinning or help your father with the wood, a cloven-hoofed demon would stuff you in a sack and carry you off to the underworld. It certainly beats a time out. And Krampus wasn't alone. In German and Austrian folklore, there was also Perchta, the belly slitter. Perchta was a goddess or a witch who roamed the countryside during the 12 days of Christmas. She was obsessed with the quality of your spinning. If she found a hard-working girl who had finished all her flax, she might leave a silver coin. But if you were lazy, Perchta was said to rip open your stomach and fill it with straw and stones. It sounds incredibly gruesome to us, but these stories served a purpose. Winter was a time when everyone had to pull their weight. Laziness wasn't just a character flaw. It was a threat to the family's survival. These terrifying tales were the social glue that kept the household productive when it was tempting to just curl up and sleep the winter away. Of course, not all winter tales were about monsters and belly slitting. Some were about the return of the light. Medieval people lived by the cycles of the sun in a way we can hardly understand. The winter solstice was the pivot point of the year. It was the moment when the darkness finally began to retreat, even if the coldest months were still ahead. This is where we see the beautiful blending of pagan traditions and Christian stories. The Yule log is a perfect example. A massive log, often the root of an oak tree, would be brought into the house with great ceremony. It was supposed to burn for at least 12 days. It brought light into the darkest part of the year and was believed to protect the house from lightning and fire in the coming year. As the family sat around the burning log, they would tell stories of the saints, but they would also tell older stories about the Green Man or the Holly King battling the Oak King for control of the forest. These stories gave them hope. They reminded everyone that the world wasn't actually dying. It was just sleeping, and the sun would eventually find its way back to them. Storytelling was also the primary way history was passed down. Without books or the internet, the elders of the village were the living libraries. In the winter, they were the most important people in the room. They would tell tales of grand kings like Charlemagne or the legendary exploits of Robin Hood. Interestingly, medieval Robin Hood stories weren't all sunny days in Sherwood Forest. Some involved the grim reality of surviving in the woods during a winter freeze, highlighting the same resilience the peasants themselves needed. They also told the stories of their own ancestors. Your grandfather might tell you about the great frost of 40 years ago, how the river froze so thick you could lead an ox across it, and how the village survived by sharing their last bags of grain. These weren't just idle memories. They were lessons. They taught the younger generation that they came from a line of survivors. It gave them the mental toughness to get through one more shivering night. We should also talk about the wolves. In a medieval winter, wolves were the ultimate symbol of the hungry, encroaching wild. As the snow got deeper and their usual prey disappeared, wolves would move closer to human settlements. You could hear them howling just beyond the village fence, a sound that chilled the blood more than the wind ever could. Naturally, the wolf became a central figure in winter folklore. But these weren't just animals. They were werewolves, or spirits in animal skin. The fear of the wolf was so intense that it manifested in stories of men who could shift their shapes on the full moon of winter. It was a way to process the fear of the predator. If the wolf was a monster, then perhaps it could be outsmarted or defeated with a silver charm or a prayer. It was a terrifying reality turned into a manageable myth. As the night wore on and the fire banked down into glowing coals, the tone of the stories would change. The scary monsters and grand hunts would give way to quieter, more contemplative tales. They would talk about the mysteries of the stars or the strange sightings in the woods. They might gossip about the neighbor who claimed to have seen a lady in white near the frozen well. This was the medieval version of late-night television, a way to pass the hours of mandatory wakefulness we discussed earlier. It kept the mind occupied so it wouldn't dwell on the cold or the empty stomach. In a way, these stories were a form of mental insulation. Just as mud and dung kept the wind out of the house, folklore kept the despair out of the heart. By the time the fire was just a few shimmering embers and the house was settling into its deep, communal sleep, the world outside didn't seem quite so empty. It was full of spirits, ancestors, heroes, and even a few monsters to keep you on your toes. The medieval peasant didn't just endure the winter. They populated it. They turned the darkness into a theater where the battle between light and dark, good and evil, played out every night. And as they finally drifted off to sleep, tucked into their straw and huddled against their kin, the story stayed with them, dreaming of the spring that was surely, slowly, making its way back across the frozen world. Folklore wasn't just a distraction. It was a way for medieval people to organize their world. When you live in a society where so much is out of your control, the weather, the harvest, the whim of a lord, stories provide a framework. They give you a reason to keep the fire burning and a reason to trust your neighbor. They remind you that while the winter is harsh, you are part of a long, long line of people who have sat by this very hearth, told these very same stories, and survived to see the flowers bloom again. And in the silence of a medieval winter night, that hope was the warmest thing in the house. As the embers shifted and the last bits of wood turned to ash, the stories would linger in the smoky air. They were the invisible threads that tied the community together, making the isolation of the frozen countryside feel a little less lonely. Even the scariest tales served to remind everyone that they were in this together. If Krampus was coming, at least he was coming for all the naughty children in the village, and everyone knew to stay inside. If the wild hunt was riding, everyone knew to bar their doors. There was a comfort in the shared knowledge of the supernatural. It turned the unknown into the known. It made the vast, cold universe feel just a little bit smaller, a little bit more like home. And that, more than any thick wool tunic or smoky fire, was the secret to making it through to the dawn. While the peasant's hut was a masterpiece of mud, dung, and desperate hope, there was another structure in the village that stood as a literal and metaphorical fortress against the winter. The Lord's Manor. Specifically, the Great Hall. If the peasant's home was a drafty wind tunnel, the Great Hall was a slightly more impressive, stone-walled wind tunnel with better snacks. But for the medieval community, this building was more than just the home of the local tax collector. It was the central sun of their small, frozen solar system. In the heart of winter, the Great Hall transformed into a space of community, redistribution, and survival that kept the social fabric from fraying into frozen threads. To understand why the Great Hall mattered so much, you have to understand the medieval contract. It wasn't just about the peasants working the land and the lord taking a cut of the grain. It was a two-way street, or at least a very muddy path that went in both directions. In exchange for the grueling labor provided during the harvest, the lord had a feudal obligation to protect his people. In the summer, that meant protection from roving bandits or rival knights. But in the winter, the enemy was hunger and the cold. The Great Hall was the place where that protection became physical. It was where the lord was expected to open his doors and, quite literally, share the wealth. Imagine walking from your tiny, smoke-filled hovel through knee-deep snow toward the manor house. As you approach, the Great Hall loomed out of the gray winter mist like a stone island. Inside, the space was vast. It had high, timbered ceilings that disappeared into a haze of wood smoke, and walls that were thick enough to actually hold back a blizzard. For a peasant who spent most of the year in a one-room hut, entering the Great Hall must have felt like stepping into another dimension. A dimension that smelled of roasted meat, stale ale, and the damp fur of 20 different hunting hounds, but another dimension nonetheless. The focal point of the hall was the central hearth. Unlike the tiny fire pit in a peasant's home, the Lord's fire was a monstrous, roaring beast. Great logs, sometimes entire tree trunks, were dragged in to keep the flames high. Because the hall was so large, the heat didn't exactly reach every corner. You still had that classic medieval experience of being roasted on one side while your other side turned into a human popsicle. But compared to the sputtering embers at home, it was luxury. And luxury, in the middle of a 14th century winter, was measured by how many inches you could sit from a flame without your tunic catching fire. One of the most important functions of the hall during winter was the redistribution of food. This wasn't just about the Lord being a nice guy. It was part of the system. During the harvest, the Lord's barns were filled with the best grain, the fattest livestock, and the most potent ale. When the deep freeze set in and peasant supplies began to dwindle, the Great Hall became a communal kitchen. On certain feast days, or even just during the bleakest weeks of January, the Lord would host communal meals. These weren't exactly five-star dining experiences. You weren't getting a tasting menu with wine pairings. You were getting pottage. Lots and lots of pottage. This was a thick, slow-cooked stew made from whatever was available, usually grains, beans, and perhaps a bit of salt pork if it was a special occasion. But in the great hall, that pottage was cooked in massive cauldrons over the central fire. It was hot, it was heavy, and most importantly, it was provided by the manna. Along with the food came the ale. Medieval ale was thick, nutritious, and served at a temperature that could be described as slightly less than freezing. For a community facing the psychological weight of a long, dark winter, these communal meals were a lifeline. They provided the calories needed to keep the body's internal furnace burning for another few days. Social hierarchy was always present in the hall, but winter had a funny way of blurring the lines, if only just a little. At one end of the room was the high table, literally a raised wooden platform where the Lord and his family sat today. This kept them above the drafts and gave them a better view of the chaos below. Everyone else sat at long trestle tables that could be folded up and cleared away when it was time to sleep. Sitting at the lower tables meant you were closer to the dogs and the drafts, but you were also closer to the fire. It was a trade-off. Would you rather have social status or warm toes? Most peasants would have chosen the toes every single time. The floor of the great hall was an ecosystem all its own. It was covered in layers of dried rushes, which acted as a sort of medieval carpet padding. Over the course of the winter, fresh rushes were thrown down on top of the old ones. This sounds picturesque until you realize what was buried in those layers. Dropped food, spilled ale, dog hair, and whatever the local livestock left behind when they wandered through. Erasmus, a famous scholar from a later period, once described these floors as a layer of filth that remained for 20 years. But in the winter, those decomposing rushes actually provided a strange kind of insulation. They kept the cold from the stone or dirt floor from seeping directly into your feet. It was a dirty, smelly, biological barrier against the frost. If you didn't think too hard about what was living in it, it was almost cozy. The walls of the hall were often covered in tapestries. Modern people think of these as art, but in a medieval winter, they were high-tech thermal insulation. Stone walls are notoriously terrible at keeping in heat. They act like giant sponges for the cold, soaking up the freezing temperature from outside and radiating it back into the room. The tapestries created a pocket of air between the stone and the living space, acting like a giant, fancy blanket for the house. They also did a great job of muffling the sound of the wind howling against the windows. Because the windows were usually just wooden shutters or thin horn panels, the drafts were relentless. The tapestries would flutter and wave in the breeze, looking like ghosts dancing in the torchlight. The great hall also served as the entertainment hub of the village. Winter was a time of enforced idleness. You couldn't plow a frozen field, and you couldn't plant in a snowbank. Without the distraction of work, the mind could turn toward the gloom very quickly. To combat this, the hall became a theater. Traveling harpers, local storytellers, or even just a particularly charismatic neighbor would take the floor. They told stories of ancient heroes, of saints who survived impossible trials, and of the coming spring. Music was essential. The sound of a pipe or a lute cutting through the crackle of the fire helped push back the silence of the winter night. It reminded everyone that they were part of something larger than their own shivering family unit. The most famous period of communal gathering was the 12 days of Christmas. This wasn't just about opening presents. It was a carefully orchestrated social release valve. During this time, the usual rules of society were often turned upside down. A lord of misrule might be appointed, often a peasant or a low-ranking servant who would give mock orders to the real lord. There were boon days, where the lord was required to provide specific feasts for his tenants. It was a time of intense redistribution. The lord's cellar was emptied, the best wood was burned, and the village gathered in the hall to eat, drink, and forget about the ice outside. This communal living served a vital psychological purpose. Winter can be incredibly isolating. When you are stuck in a small hut with only your siblings and a very judgmental goat, the world feels very small and very dangerous. Being invited into the great hall broke that isolation. It reminded the peasants that the Lord was looking out for them, and it reminded the Lord that his power rested on the survival of his people. It was a moment of solidarity. If the village was going to make it through the hungry gap of February, they were going to do it together. Sometimes, when the weather turned particularly brutal, the great hall became a massive dormitory. The poorest members of the community, or those whose homes had suffered a roof collapse under the weight of snow, would roll out their straw mats on the rush-covered floor. They would sleep in long rows, using each other's body heat and the fading warmth of the central hearth to survive the night. It wasn't private, it wasn't quiet, and it definitely wasn't clean, but it was warm. And in the middle of a medieval winter, warmth was the only currency that mattered. As the fire in the great hall would eventually settle into glowing embers, the smoke would drift up toward the rafters, leaving the space in a soft, hazy dimness. The sound of dozens of people breathing in unison, the occasional shifting of a dog in the rushes, and the distant whistle of the wind created a strange, communal peace. The Lord's Manor wasn't a place of perfect comfort. It was still drafty, and the stone was still cold, and the social divides were still there. But it was a shared refuge. It was proof that human beings, when faced with the crushing weight of nature's cruelty, will always find a way to huddle together. They built their halls of stone and their hearts of grit, and together, they waited for the sun to return. The great hall was the anchor of the medieval winter, a place where the community was forged in the heat of a single, massive fire. It was where the Lord's duty met the peasant's resilience, and where the simple act of sharing a bowl of hot pottage became a victory against the frost. Hey guys, as we move into this part of our journey, I want you to take a deep breath and imagine that the calendar has finally turned. We are leaving the heart of the deep freeze behind, but let me tell you, for a medieval peasant, this was perhaps the most difficult stretch of all. You have survived the blizzards. You have survived the nights where the beer froze in the barrel. But now, you are entering the long, grueling wait for the world to wake up again. In the modern world, we think of February as a short month, a little bridge to spring, but in the Middle Ages, it was more like a marathon where you could see the finish line, but your legs were starting to give out. If you are still awake, try to settle a bit deeper into your blankets. Think about how lucky we are to have a pantry that stays full all year round. Because for our medieval friends, the late winter was the time of the hungry gap. This was the period when the winter stores were dwindling down to nothing, but the ground was still too hard and too cold to give anything back. It was a test of patience, a test of faith, and a test of exactly how many ways you could cook a single shriveled turnip. By the time the end of February rolled around, the atmosphere in a peasant hut was, let us be honest, probably a little tense. You have been cooped up in a one-room house with your entire family, a couple of goats, and a very confused pig for nearly 4 months. The smoke from the hearth has turned the walls black. Your clothes, those famous layers of wool and mystery stains we talked about earlier, are probably standing up on their own by now. Everyone is tired. Everyone is a little bit hungry. And everyone is staring out the tiny, hide-covered window hole, waiting for a sign. One of the biggest markers of this time was Candlemas, which fell on the 2nd of February. This was the official midpoint of winter. In the medieval mind, this was a day of great importance. It was the day you took all the candles you intended to use for the rest of the year to the church to be blessed. There was a popular saying back then that if Candlemas was fair and bright, winter would have another flight, but if it was cloudy and gray, winter would soon go away. It is funny to think that we still have a version of that today with groundhogs and shadows, but for a peasant, this was not a cute tradition. It was a desperate attempt to read the room of nature. If the sun was out on Candlemas, you did not celebrate. You groaned. It meant more weeks of huddling by the fire. It meant the grain bin was going to get even lower. You were constantly doing the math in your head. Do we have enough hay left for the cow? Can we afford to eat the last of the salted pork, or do we need to save it for a real emergency? This was the time of year when the phrase portion control really came to life. Every meal was a calculation. Every log added to the fire was a withdrawal from your survival bank account. And then, there was the psychological toll of the gray. Imagine months without seeing a true, bright blue sky. Everything was a shade of muddy brown or slate gray. The light was weak and watery, barely enough to see your own hands by mid-afternoon. This is why the return of the sun was not just a weather event. It was a spiritual homecoming. Peasants would watch the way the light hit the mud walls of their huts. They knew exactly where the sun should be at noon. When they saw that first ray of light stretching just a little bit further across the floor, it was like a shot of adrenaline. It meant the earth was tilting back. It meant the sun, their old friend, was finally coming home from his winter vacation. But the thaw, when it finally arrived, was not exactly a picturesque scene. If you think the snow was bad, let me introduce you to the medieval mud. When the ground finally started to soften, the world turned into a giant, cold, brown soup. This was the 5th season of the year, the season of the slush. Every step outside was a battle. Your wooden clogs would sink into the muck with a wet, sucking sound that probably haunted your dreams. The dirt floors inside the house would become damp as the moisture seeped up from the earth. Everything smelled like wet wool and old straw. It was not pretty, and it definitely was not comfortable, but that mud was the most beautiful thing a peasant could see. Why? Because you cannot plow a frozen field. Mud meant the earth was soft. Mud meant the work could begin. This was also the time when the livestock started to sense the change. The cows, who had been living in the corner of your house all winter, probably looking at you with deep judgment, would start to get restless. They wanted the fresh grass that was hidden beneath the melting patches of snow. The sheep would start to stir. Even the birds, those brave little souls who had stayed behind, would begin to change their tune. Hearing the first birdsong of the late winter was like hearing a herald blow a trumpet. It was the announcement that the siege of winter was finally being lifted. But even as the sun returned, the danger was not over. This was the time of the seasonal fevers. After months of breathing in wood smoke and living in damp, cramped quarters, people were weak. Their immune systems, though they did not call them that back then, were at their lowest point. A simple cold in March could be more dangerous than a blizzard in December because your body had no reserves left. This is why there was so much emphasis on spring tonics. Grandma would come out with a pot of something that smelled like swamp water and bitter roots, insisting that it would purify the blood. Spoiler, it probably just tasted terrible, but the act of drinking it was a ritual of survival. You were cleaning out the winter. You were preparing your body for the heavy labor that was just around the corner. The return of the sun also meant the return of the social world. During the deepest part of winter, your world was the size of your hut. You might not see your neighbors for weeks if the snow was high. But as the paths cleared, you would start to see people again. You would lean over a fence and gossip about who had run out of firewood first. You would check on the elderly widow at the end of the lane to see if she had made it through. There was a sense of shared victory. We did it. We are still here. We survived another one. As the days grew longer, the rhythm of the house changed. You did not have to bank the fire quite so heavily at night. You could leave the door open for an hour in the afternoon to let the stale, smoky air out and the crisp, cool scent of the waking earth in. You would start to bring out the tools. The plow would be checked for cracks. The hose would be sharpened. The seed grain, which you had guarded like a pile of gold all winter, would be brought out and inspected. This was the most sacred moment of the year. That grain represented your future. If the damp had gotten to it and it had rotted, you were in trouble. But if it was dry and firm, you had a chance. The transition from winter to spring was not a single moment. It was a slow, agonizingly beautiful crawl. It was the sound of water dripping from the thatch. It was the feeling of the wind changing from a biting blade to a gentle nudge. It was the sight of the first green shoots of wild garlic or nettles pushing through the dead leaves. To a medieval peasant, those first greens were more valuable than a king's jewels. They were the first fresh food in months, full of the vitamins their bodies were screaming for. They would gather them by the handful, boiling them into a bright, bitter soup that tasted like life itself. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about that slow return of the sun. Think about the patience it took to sit in the dark and wait for the world to turn. The medieval winter was a long, hard tunnel, but the light at the end of it was the most glorious thing imaginable. They did not take the sun for granted. They did not take the mud for granted. Every longer shadow, every melting icicle, and every warmer breeze was a gift. They had looked into the eyes of the frost and they had not blinked. And now, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, they could finally put down their heavy cloaks, stretch their stiff limbs, and get back to the work of living. The sun is returning. The world is softening. The long wait is almost over. You have made it through the cold. You have survived the dark. Now, it is time to rest and wait for the green to return. Just like the medieval peasant, you can finally let go of the tension of the winter and drift into a deep, well-earned sleep. The light is coming back. The earth is waking up. Everything is going to be just fine. Congratulations. You survived the medieval winter. Now, just breathe, listen to the dripping of the thaw, and let yourself go. Sleep well. Sleep deep. The sun will be there when you wake. The long silence of the frozen fields is finally beginning to crack. If you listen closely, you can hear it. It is not a sudden sound, but a slow, rhythmic dripping. It is the sound of icicles losing their grip on the eaves of the barn and the soft, heavy thud of snow sliding off the thatched roofs. 4 months, the earth has been a sealed tomb, hard as iron and cold as a forgotten stone. But now, the air carries a different scent. It is the smell of dampness, of ancient hidden things waking up, and of mud. Lots and lots of mud. To a medieval peasant, this transition wasn't just a change in the weather. It was the signal that the season of huddling was over and the season of back-breaking labor was about to begin. The transition from the hearth to the field was a slow, squelchy journey, and it began with the preparation for that very first furrow. Before a single seed could be cast, there was the matter of the tools. Imagine spending all winter in a dark, smoky hut, and then realizing your most important piece of technology has been sitting in a drafty shed, slowly gathering rust and cobwebs. The plow was the center of the medieval world, and it was a beast of a machine. We aren't talking about a little hand tool you might use to turn over your garden. For the heavy soils of northern Europe, the peasants used what historians call the karuka. This was a massive, wheeled plow made of heavy timber and iron. It was designed to do more than just scratch the surface. It was built to rip into the heavy, wet clay, lift it up, and flip it over. But after a winter of neglect, that plow needed some serious love. The peasants spent those first gray, misty days of late winter checking the wooden frame for rot and the iron parts for damage. The most important bit was the coulter, a heavy iron blade that sliced vertically through the sod. Then came the plowshare, which cut horizontally under the roots. Finally, there was the moldboard, a curved wooden piece that acted like a giant wave, lifting the heavy soil and turning it over to create a neat ridge. If any of these parts were cracked or dull, the first day in the field would be a disaster. You can almost picture the village blacksmith becoming the most popular person in town, his forge glowing late into the night as he hammered out the nicks and dents from a dozen different plowshares. It was a time of anticipation, a nervous energy that hummed through the village as everyone looked at the melting snow and wondered if the ground would be dry enough to support the weight of the team. And then, of course, there were the true heroes of the story. The oxen. These weren't just animals. They were the engines of the medieval world. After a winter spent inside the longhouse, sharing their body heat with the family and eating the last of the dried hay, the oxen were often a bit thin and lethargic. A peasant had to be careful. You couldn't just drag them out and expect them to pull 1,000 pounds through the muck on day one. They had to be groomed, their hooves checked, and their yokes adjusted. The yoke was a heavy wooden beam that rested across the necks of a pair of oxen, and it had to fit perfectly. If it rubbed them the wrong way, you ended up with an injured animal and a field that stayed unplowed. But here was the catch. A full plough team usually required 8 oxen. Now, most peasants were lucky if they owned 1 or 2. This meant that the first furrow was a communal project. You had to negotiate with your neighbors. You bring your 2 oxen, I will bring my 2, and we will borrow the other 4 from the smith and the miller. This led to the kind of complex social networking that would make a modern office manager cry. Who gets their field plowed first? Who gets the strongest oxen? Who is responsible if a yoke breaks? It was a delicate dance of cooperation and occasional grumbling, all performed while standing knee-deep in freezing cold slurry. Before the team actually hit the dirt, there was a tradition to observe. In many parts of Europe, this was known as Plough Monday. It was the first Monday after Epiphany, and it served as the official start of the agricultural year. It was a day of half work and half celebration. The young men of the village would decorate a plough with ribbons and drag it from house to house, singing songs and asking for small gifts or coins to fund the plough light. A candle kept burning in the church to bless the coming harvest. It was a way of building up a bit of communal spirit before the long, grueling weeks of labor began. It was also a bit of a rowdy time. If a householder refused to give a small donation, the young men might just plough up the ground right in front of their doorstep as a prank. It was a reminder that the plough was a tool of life, but it was also a force of nature that couldn't be ignored. When the day finally arrived to break the ground, the reality of the task was enough to make even the strongest peasant sigh. Medieval fields were not the neat, flat squares we see today. They were long, narrow strips, often filled with rocks, stubborn roots, and patches of ice that hadn't quite realized it was spring yet. The first furrow was the hardest. The soil was cold and heavy with water, clinging to the mold board like wet concrete. Imagine trying to push a heavy shopping cart through a foot of thick mud, and you might have a tiny idea of what it was like. The peasant at the back of the plough had to lean his entire weight into the handles just to keep the blade at the right depth. If he hit a hidden stone, the handles could kick back and crack a rib or knock the wind out of him. Meanwhile, a younger boy, often a son or an apprentice, walked at the head of the team with a long stick called a goad. He had to keep the oxen moving in a straight line, talking to them, calling them by name, and occasionally giving them a gentle poke to keep them focused. The team moved at a slow, plodding crawl. There was no rushing this. The air would be filled with the sound of the boy's voice, the heavy, wet sucking sound of the soil being turned, and the rhythmic creaking of the wooden frame. As that first furrow was turned, the smell would hit you. It was a raw, primal scent. The smell of the deep earth being exposed to the sun for the first time in months. It was the smell of minerals, of old decaying leaves, and of the promise of life. For a peasant who had been eating dried peas and salty bacon for months, that smell was the most beautiful thing in the world. It meant that the hungry gap, that dangerous time in late winter when the stores were almost gone and the new crops hadn't grown yet, was finally being bridged. Following behind the plough, a cloud of crows and gulls would descend, frantically pecking at the grubs and worms turned up by the blade. It was a chaotic, noisy parade. The dark birds, the brown mud, the white breath of the oxen, and the gray, drizzling sky. The work was exhausting, and the progress was measured in inches. By the end of the day, the peasant's boots would be heavy with pounds of clinging clay, his woolen tunic would be damp with sweat and rain, and his muscles would be screaming. But as he looked back at the field, he could see the long, dark line of turned earth standing out against the dead yellow grass of winter. It was a scar on the land, but it was a beautiful scar. This first furrow also dictated the shape of the landscape. Because the heavy plough was so difficult to turn, the fields were ploughed in long, straight strips. To turn a team of 8 oxen and a massive wooden plough required a lot of space. This area at the end of the field was called the headland. It was where the team would execute a slow, wide U-turn before starting the next strip in the opposite direction. Over years and decades, this method of ploughing created a unique undulating pattern in the soil called ridge and furrow. Even today, if you fly over parts of England or France, you can still see these ancient ripples in the fields, the ghosts of 1,000 years of spring plowing. As the sun began to dip behind the bare trees, the peasant would finally unyoke the oxen. They would plod back to the village, their heads low, their sides heaving. The peasant would scrape the worst of the mud from his boots and his tools, knowing that tomorrow he would have to do it all over again. And the day after that. And the day after that. It was a race against time. The seeds had to be in the ground before the spring rains became too heavy, but not so early that a late frost would kill the sprouts. It was a gamble that every generation had to play. But tonight, as he walked back toward the flickering light of his hearth, there was a sense of quiet victory. The ground was broken. The winter was truly over. The first step toward the next harvest had been taken. He might be cold, he might be hungry, and his back might feel like it was made of old, brittle wood, but he had survived the frost, and he had claimed the first furrow. The earth was waking up, and he was there to meet it. He would go home, perhaps share a crust of bread and a cup of thin ale, and sleep the heavy, dreamless sleep of a man who has wrestled with the earth and won. The cycle had begun again, and in the dark, damp fields, the first line of hope had been drawn in the mud.